Here in this hollow, what's left of a still in a life blackened by a lie. In '68, Red Rube McClary was sent away on evidence the courts later called planted. 5 years later,
Between August 3rd and August 31st, 1974, 17 federal revenue agents died during systematic campaign by Red Rube Caldwell, who'd eliminated everyone responsible for framing him with planted evidence during Moonshine raid that had resulted in 5-year imprisonment despite his innocence and despite evidence proving that agents had fabricated still operation to justify raid quotas that federal supervisors required for maintaining funding and for demonstrating enforcement. Success in Appalachian region, where legitimate moonshine operations were becoming increasingly rare, as legal alcohol distribution had replaced illegal distilling that Prohibition era had made profitable. By September 4th, all 17 agents who'd participated in raid, evidence fabrication, or perjured testimony during trial were dead. Their bodies discovered throughout Hancock County, Tennessee, where 53-year-old Red Rube had systematically eliminated federal officers through methods demonstrating that when government agencies prosecute innocent citizens based on fabricated evidence to justify budgets and quotas, then victims will deliver justice that courts declined to provide, even when appeals had documented official misconduct rather than defendants' guilt, but had been denied by appellate courts deferring to trial verdicts despite clear evidence of frame-up. Hancock County, Tennessee, occupied 222 square miles of rugged mountainous terrain along Virginia border in 1974, populated by approximately 6,000 people, mostly farming small plots or working in declining timber operations that mechanization had made less labor-intensive. Isolated community where traditional Appalachian culture maintained strong suspicion of federal authority dating to Civil War occupation, and reinforced by decades of revenue agent raids targeting moonshine production that mountain people viewed as traditional craft and legitimate economic activity rather than as tax evasion deserving criminal prosecution. The county seat of Sneedville was a small town of barely 1,000 residents. Commercial center where courthouse and handful of businesses served surrounding mountain communities that valued independence and self-sufficiency and that resented outside interference, particularly from federal government whose regulations and taxation mountain people characterized as violations of liberty that Constitution supposedly protected. August 1974 meant sweltering heat in mountain valleys where humidity made physical labor nearly unbearable and where creeks that normally provided cooling relief had slowed to trickles during drought that agricultural extension, agents warned, could devastate autumn harvests if rains didn't resume soon. Weather conditions that made tempers short and that increased tensions in region where economic hardships were worsening, as traditional mountain livelihoods became increasingly unviable when competing against mechanized operations, and when young people were leaving for urban employment opportunities that Appalachian Tennessee couldn't provide. The month also marked a period of heightened federal enforcement when Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Bureau had announced new initiative targeting illegal distilling operations, announcement that mountain communities viewed with suspicion given that moonshine production had declined dramatically since Prohibition's repeal decades earlier, and given that legitimate liquor distribution had made illegal distilling economically marginal activity pursued by few rather than widespread practice that had once been common throughout region. Red Rube Caldwell was 53 years old in August 1974, had spent 47 years living on same mountain property where his family had resided since 1822 when ancestors had migrated from North Carolina seeking land that western Tennessee mountains provided. property that Red Rube had inherited from father who died in 1968, and that included approximately 80 acres of steep hillside terrain, suitable primarily for subsistence farming and for timber harvesting that provided irregular income when market prices made selling logs profitable. Red Rube had never operated moonshine. Still, despite family history that included grandfather who'd been legendary distiller during Prohibition era, had instead supported himself through combination of farming, logging, occasional carpentry work, and disability payments from injuries suffered during Korean War service that had left him with damaged knee, limiting his mobility but not preventing him from managing property and performing physical labor that mountain living required. Red Rube's imprisonment for moonshine operation he'd never conducted had resulted from federal raid in March 1969 when 17 ATF agents led by Special Agent Marcus Webb had descended on Caldwell property claiming they'd received intelligence about large-scale distilling operation producing approximately 500 gallons monthly. Raid had discovered copper, still equipment, oak barrels, corn sugar, and approximately 200 gallons of finished product hidden in barn and in storage shed on property. Evidence that agents claimed proved Red Rube was operating substantial illegal distillery requiring prosecution under federal tax evasion statutes, carrying mandatory minimum sentences designed to deter moonshining that Treasury Department characterized as serious crime depriving government of revenue and undermining legal alcohol industry. But evidence had been planted by agents who'd fabricated entire operation to meet raid quotas that ATF supervisors required for justifying budget allocations and for demonstrating enforcement effectiveness in region where actual day moonshine operations had become rare enough that legitimate targets were insufficient for maintaining raid numbers that Washington headquarters expected based on historical patterns from decades earlier when illegal distilling had been widespread throughout Appalachian regions. Internal ATF documents discovered years later would prove that Webb and his team had purchased still equipment and supplies at auctions of seized property from previous raids, had transported materials to Caldwell property during night before official raid occurred, had planted everything in locations where discovery would seem plausible during legitimate search, had then conducted raid based on fabricated tip from confidential informant, who didn't actually exist but whose reports agents created through falsifying documentation. Red Rube had been working in timber lot approximately 2 miles from house when raid occurred, had returned home to discover federal agents searching property and seizing equipment that he'd never seen before, had immediately protested that someone had planted evidence because he didn't operate still and never had during his entire life, despite family history of distilling. Agents had dismissed protestations, had arrested Red Rube for federal tax evasion and for operating unregistered distillery, had testified during preliminary hearing that confidential informant had provided detailed intelligence about operation, and that raid had confirmed informant's accuracy when discovering substantial distilling equipment and finished product proving defendant's guilt. Trial had occurred in July 1969 at federal courthouse in Knoxville. Prosecution had presented testimony from 17 ATF agents describing raid and evidence discovered, had introduced photographs showing still equipment and barrels and products seized from Caldwell property, had argued that defendants' claims about planted evidence were desperate fabrications by criminal, caught through good intelligence work and thorough investigation. Defense had presented character witnesses from Hancock County testifying that Red Rube had never been involved with moonshining, had introduced evidence that Red Rube had been working miles away when raid occurred and hadn't been present at property during time when distilling would have been conducted. had argued that absence of any previous suspected moonshine activity from defendant, whose family and property had been well known to local law enforcement for decades, suggested that sudden discovery of large operation was suspicious and warranted skepticism about prosecution's evidence. But federal jury in Knoxville had convicted Red Rube after deliberating only 3 hours. Verdict reflected jurors' deference to federal agents' testimony over defendants' denials, even when circumstantial evidence suggested possibility of frame-up. Verdict also reflected prejudices about Appalachian culture and moonshining history that made urban jurors predisposed to believe that mountain man from family with distilling background would naturally be involved with illegal alcohol production, regardless of evidence suggesting otherwise. Judge had sentenced Red Rube to 5 years federal imprisonment, mandatory minimum under sentencing guidelines that didn't allow for departures based on extraordinary circumstances or on questions about evidence reliability when jury had rendered guilty verdict. Red Rube had served full 5 years at federal penitentiary in Atlanta, had been released in July 1974 after completing sentence with no parole, because he'd refused to admit guilt or to cooperate with authorities attempting to identify suppliers or distributors that prosecution claimed must have existed for operation producing 200 gallons. Refusal that prison officials had interpreted as obstinacy warranting denial of early release that acknowledgement of guilt and cooperation might have earned. Upon release, Red Rube had returned to Hancock County, discovering that property had deteriorated during 5 years of abandonment when no family members had been available to maintain buildings or to manage timber lots that needed periodic attention for preventing overgrowth and for preserving commercial value. Red Rube's decision to systematically eliminate 17 agents who'd participated in frame-up was made during first weeks after release, when he'd realized that appealing conviction or seeking exoneration through legal channels would be futile, given that courts had already rejected his claims during trial and during unsuccessful appeal that had been denied by Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, deferring to jury verdict and to district court's findings. That evidence had been sufficient for conviction. Red Rube understood that systematic campaign would result in his death or imprisonment, but believed that exposing federal corruption and delivering justice that legal system had refused to provide justified sacrificing freedom that he'd already lost for 5 years when innocent of crimes he'd been convicted of committing. The systematic elimination began August 3rd when Special Agent Thomas Mitchell was found dead at remote location in Hancock County, where he'd been conducting follow-up investigation related to continuing enforcement operations. Shot twice in chest from hunting rifle, firing from distance of approximately 100 yards. Killing demonstrated precision marksmanship consistent with military training that Red Rube had received during Korean War service, where he'd been infantry sniper, earning commendations for accuracy during combat operations. Investigation revealed that Mitchell had been alone when killed, had been examining area where agents suspected new moonshine operation might be located based on tips similar to fabricated intelligence that had led to Red Rube's frame-up years earlier. Special Agent Marcus Webb, who'd led 1,969 raid on Caldwell property, died August 6th under similar circumstances, shot 3 times while inspecting property in remote mountain location. Killing occurred despite Webb having been accompanied by 2 additional agents who'd been searching nearby area when shooting occurred and who hadn't observed shooter, who'd apparently fired from concealed position at considerable distance before disappearing into dense forest that provided escape routes, allowing perpetrator to avoid detection. Webb's death was particularly significant because he'd been primary agent organizing frame-up and testifying during trial about discovering evidence that investigation would later prove had been planted deliberately. Pattern became unmistakable when additional agents died throughout August, with shootings occurring at remote locations where victims had been conducting enforcement operations or surveillance. Circumstances suggested that perpetrator was targeting agents when they were vulnerable in isolated areas rather than attempting attacks in town or at federal offices where security would have made successful eliminations more difficult, and where witnesses would have been likely to observe shooter. Federal authorities recognized that systematic campaign was targeting ATF personnel specifically rather than representing random violence. Realization prompted heightened security, including requiring agents to work in teams and assigning protective details from U.S. Marshals Service. But security measures proved inadequate when additional victims continued dying despite precautions. Agent William Bradford was killed August 9th when explosive device detonated under vehicle as he'd started engine. Explosions suggested that perpetrator had expanded methodology beyond long-range shooting to include bombs that could be planted during darkness, eliminating need for shooter to be present at moment of killing. Agent Robert Harrison died August 12th from poisoning that investigation. Determined had been strychnine administered in coffee during breakfast at diner where agents frequently met before beginning daily operations. Death demonstrated that perpetrator was employing diverse methods, creating uncertainty about how attacks would occur and making protection difficult when threats could come through various means. Additional agents died throughout late August as systematic campaign continued despite massive federal manhunt involving FBI and U.S. Marshals supplementing ATF investigators who'd recognized they were overwhelmed by killer capable of striking targets at will despite protective measures. Deaths occurred through shootings at distances exceeding typical engagement ranges, through explosives planted at vehicles and at residences, through poisoning that investigation suggested had been administered in food or drink at locations where agents regularly visited. Versatility made, predicting when and how next attack would occur, nearly impossible, forcing federal authorities to implement extraordinary security that strained resources and created atmosphere of fear throughout ATF personnel working in Tennessee and surrounding states. By August 31st, 17 agents were dead from systematic campaign that had proceeded with military precision, suggesting combat training and extensive preparation, allowing perpetrator to successfully eliminate multiple federal officers while evading capture despite intensive investigation, deploying hundreds of personnel searching Appalachian mountains where suspect familiar with terrain could remain concealed indefinitely if adequately supplied. Recognition of perpetrator's identity came from ballistic analysis matching bullets recovered from early shooting victims to rifle type commonly used for deer hunting throughout region, but that forensic examination revealed had specific barrel wear patterns matching weapon that military records showed had been issued to Red Rube Caldwell during Korean War service, and that had been returned to him following honorable discharge. Massive manhunt focused on Hancock County mountains where Red Rube was presumed to be hiding. Federal authorities deployed tracking teams with dogs, helicopters with thermal imaging equipment, roadblocks preventing escape from region, coordinated search that represented one of the largest federal law enforcement operations in Tennessee history, attempting to capture individual who'd killed more federal agents than any previous domestic terrorist. But manhunt discovered that Red Rube had disappeared into mountains where a lifetime of experience provided knowledge about trails and hiding places that outsiders couldn't match, where local populations sympathetic to Mountain Man framed by corrupt federal agents refused to provide information that might assist authorities attempting to capture him. Red Rube remained at large for 6 weeks before surrendering voluntarily on October 15th at Hancock County Courthouse. Walked into building carrying written confession explaining that he'd killed 17 ATF agents who'd participated in framing him with planted evidence during 1969 raid That systematic elimination had been necessary response to federal corruption that had destroyed 5 years of his life through imprisoning innocent man to meet quotas and to justify budget allocations. That exposing misconduct and delivering accountability that legal system had refused to provide required violence that society would condemn, but that moral desperation had necessitated when appeals had been denied and when official channels had demonstrated complete unwillingness to acknowledge frame-up despite evidence suggesting planted equipment. Red Rube's confession was detailed explanation of planning and execution, including how he'd compiled target list of 17 agents who'd participated in raid or had testified during trial, providing fabricated evidence. About confidential informant and about operational details that investigation would later prove had been falsified, how he'd researched each agent's routines and vulnerabilities through surveillance conducted during weeks following release from prison, how he'd employed sniper skills from military service combined with improvised explosives knowledge and with poisoning methods researched through library books, how he'd systematically eliminated 17 people over a 4-week period while evading massive manhunt through knowledge of terrain and through assistance from local population that had hidden him and had refused to cooperate, with federal authorities attempting to locate him. Confession concluded with statement that surrendering was preferable to being killed during confrontation or to continuing indefinitely as fugitive, that he'd accomplished mission of exposing ATF corruption through eliminating agents responsible for frame-up, and that accepting consequences was necessary final step in campaign delivering justice that courts had systematically refused to provide despite clear evidence that conviction had been based on planted evidence rather than on legitimate discovery of actual moonshine operation. Red Rube also stated that confession included details about ATF evidence fabrication that he'd discovered during imprisonment through corresponding with family members who'd conducted investigation attempting to prove innocence. Details that federal authorities would be forced to acknowledge when evaluating whether confession's claims about frame-up were accurate or whether they were fabrications designed to justify murders. Trial for 17 murders occurred in February 1975 at Federal Courthouse in Knoxville with extraordinary security including metal detectors, armed guards throughout building, screening of spectators attempting to attend proceedings that attracted national media attention because of systematic nature of killings and because of defendants' claims about ATF corruption creating frame-up that had motivated campaign. Prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including confession, ballistic matches linking Red Rube to shootings, bomb fragments with materials traced to purchases he'd made, pharmacy records showing strychnine acquisition, testimony from witnesses who'd observed him conducting surveillance of victims during weeks before killings began. Defense didn't dispute that Red Rube had committed 17 murders, but argued that systematic campaign had been desperate response to being falsely imprisoned based on evidence that ATF agents had planted deliberately to meet raid quotas. Presented evidence that investigation of 1,969 raid revealed suspicious aspects including Red Rube's absence from property when raid occurred, lack of any previous moonshine activity from defendant despite family history making him obvious target if he'd actually been distilling, sudden appearance of substantial operation that neighbors claimed hadn't existed before, raid suggesting equipment had been planted. Defense also introduced evidence discovered during Red Rube's imprisonment showing that ATF had pattern of fabricating raids to justify budgets, that Webb and other agents killed during campaign had been subjects of internal investigations, examining whether they'd falsified reports about confidential informants and about evidence discovered during raids. Most dramatic defense evidence came from testimony of former ATF agent David Morrison, who'd resigned from agency in 1972 after reporting concerns about evidence fabrication to supervisors who'd dismissed complaints and had threatened retaliation if Morrison continued raising questions about raid practices. Morrison testified that he'd participated in dozens of raids during 1968 to 1972 period where evidence had been planted to justify operations when legitimate intelligence about actual moonshine activities wasn't available. Explained that pressure to maintain raid numbers created an environment where agents fabricated operations rather than admitting that enforcement targets were becoming scarce as moonshining declined throughout Appalachian regions where legal alcohol distribution had eliminated economic incentives for illegal distilling. Morrison's testimony was corroborated by documents he'd preserved showing internal ATF communications discussing quota pressures and showing supervisors encouraging field agents to be creative in developing probable cause for raids when traditional intelligence sources weren't producing sufficient targets, communications that clearly suggested systematic fabrication rather than isolated misconduct by individual agents acting independently. Documents proved that Red Rube's claims about being framed weren't desperate fabrications, but were accurate descriptions of how ATF had been operating throughout late 1,960 and early 1,970 when budget pressures and organizational expectations had created incentives for agents to manufacture evidence justifying raids that quota requirements demanded regardless of whether actual illegal activity existed. Prosecution attempted to discredit Morrison's testimony through emphasizing that he'd been disgruntled former employee with grudges against agency, and through arguing that even if ATF had problems with evidence fabrication, that didn't justify Red Rube's systematic murder of 17 federal officers who'd been following orders and organizational practices that supervisors had encouraged or required. Prosecutor emphasized that appropriate response to being falsely convicted would have been continued appeals and civil litigation seeking damages rather than vigilante campaign killing people whose individual culpability might have been limited when systematic pressures rather than personal malice had motivated participation in frame-up. Jury deliberated 12 days before returning guilty verdicts on all 17 murder counts. Longest federal jury deliberation in Tennessee history reflected internal debates about whether Red Rube's circumstances created mitigation, even though law clearly prohibited systematic killing regardless of provocations or institutional failures. Jurors explained afterward that they'd been deeply conflicted about convicting man whose claims about frame-up had been substantially corroborated by Morrison's testimony and by documentary evidence proving ATF corruption. That overwhelming evidence of guilt on murder charges made conviction mandatory, but that moral complexity made simple guilty verdicts seem inadequate for capturing reality. That federal misconduct had created situation where innocent man, imprisoned for 5 years, had employed terrorism that officials' corruption had provoked. Judge sentenced Red Rube to death by lethal injection. Federal capital punishment for multiple premeditated murders of federal officers. Sentence was mandatory given jury's findings in federal death penalty statute that required capital punishment for killing law enforcement personnel during commission of crimes, even though circumstances were extraordinary and even though many observers believed that ATF agents whose corruption had motivated campaign bore responsibility exceeding what law could acknowledge when legal frameworks treated systematic eliminations as terrorism while immunizing federal agents' misconduct from equivalent accountability through qualified immunity doctrines and through prosecutorial discretion that had declined to pursue charges against agents who'd fabricated evidence. Red Rube's execution was scheduled for August 1975, but attracted massive national attention from civil liberties organizations, highlighting how federal agency corruption and evidence fabrication created desperate responses. Petitions seeking clemency gathered over 400,000 signatures, arguing that executing man who'd been falsely imprisoned based on planted evidence represented compounding injustice rather than delivering appropriate punishment. That ATF agents' corruption had destroyed innocent man's life, creating circumstances where violence that courts condemned had been motivated by institutional failures exceeding individual culpability that legal frameworks could adequately address. President Gerald Ford reviewed clemency petition in July 1975, commuted sentence to life imprisonment without parole, citing extraordinary circumstances while maintaining that systematic murder of 17 federal agents couldn't be excused regardless of ATF corruption motivating campaign or of evidence proving that Red Rube had been innocent of charges that had resulted in 5 years imprisonment. Ford's commutation reflected political calculation, balancing law enforcement opposition to clemency against public sympathy for man whose violence had exposed real federal corruption even though methods were indefensible. Decision also reflected recognition that executing Red Rube would make him martyr for anti-government movements throughout Appalachian regions where federal authority remained contested and where population viewed ATF enforcement as illegitimate intrusion on traditional practices that mountain culture valued as expressions of independence from outside control. Commutation allowed federal government to avoid appearance of executing victim of its own corruption while still punishing systematic violence that couldn't be condoned publicly, even when privately many officials acknowledged that institutional failures had created circumstances provoking desperate response. Red Rube served 34 years at federal penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, before dying in 2009 at age 88 from complications of emphysema that decades of smoking and exposure to coal dust during occasional mining work had caused. Condition that inadequate prison medical care had allowed to deteriorate into respiratory failure, requiring hospice treatment during final months that prison officials had reluctantly provided when advocacy organizations had pressured them to ensure humane end-of-life care. He was buried in family cemetery on Hancock County property that distant relatives had maintained during decades of his imprisonment. Funeral attended by approximately 1,200 community members, including many who'd supported his campaign against corrupt federal agents and who viewed his systematic eliminations as justified response to government tyranny that ATF evidence fabrication had exemplified. During 34 years of imprisonment, Red Rube became symbol for movements challenging federal regulatory authority and advocating accountability for law enforcement misconduct. His case was cited extensively by libertarian organizations and by Appalachian cultural preservation groups, highlighting how federal agencies fabricated evidence to justify budgets and to maintain enforcement operations targeting traditional practices that mountain communities viewed as legitimate expressions of cultural identity rather than as crimes deserving prosecution. His story also resonated with broader movements emerging during 1990 seconds challenging qualified immunity doctrine and prosecutorial discretion that protected officials from accountability when misconduct destroyed innocent lives. The 21st century brought renewed attention to Red Rube Caldwell case when investigative journalist Patricia Morrison obtained previously classified ATF internal documents through Freedom of Information Act litigation Documents proved definitively that Webb and team had planted evidence during 1969 raid as part of systematic practice affecting dozens of defendants throughout Tennessee and Kentucky during late 1960s when quota pressures had created incentives for fabricating operations. Morrison published findings in 2015 book titled Revenue Men's Revenge: How ATF Fabricated Moonshine Raids and Created Appalachian Terrorists, comprehensive examination documenting Red Rube's false conviction through trial records, appeal denials, systematic elimination campaign, Morrison's testimony about fabrication patterns, newly released documents proving extent of corruption. Most shocking discovery was documentation proving that ATF supervisors had known about evidence fabrication and had explicitly encouraged practice through memos circulated in 1968 instructing field agents that creative development of probable cause was acceptable when necessary for maintaining raid numbers that budget justifications required. Memo demonstrated that corruption extended beyond individual agents to organizational leadership that had sanctioned fabrication as policy rather than as unauthorized misconduct by rogue personnel. Discovery generated calls for Justice Department investigation of historical ATF practices and for posthumous exoneration of Red Rube and other defendants whose convictions had been based on planted evidence. Documentary filmmaker Sarah Thompson produced comprehensive examination in 2017, film titled Red Rube's War: When Federal Corruption Creates Desperate Violence, featuring interviews with historians, former ATF agents discussing agency culture during 1,960 seconds, 1,970 seconds. Morrison presenting research findings, descendants of Red Rube and of killed agents expressing perspectives on whether systematic elimination of 17 people had been justified response to being framed, or whether violence exceeded what circumstances warranted, even acknowledging that conviction had been false and that imprisonment had destroyed 5 years of innocent man's life. Most powerful segment featured interview with Jennifer Caldwell, age 42 in 2017, and great niece of Red Rube, describing how learning about great uncle's frame-up and about ATF corruption had motivated her advocacy for criminal justice reform and for accountability mechanisms preventing federal agencies from fabricating evidence to justify budgets and enforcement operations. Jennifer explained that discovering that great-uncle Red Rube had been imprisoned for 5 years based on evidence that ATF agents deliberately planted to meet quotas, and that he'd then systematically killed 17 agents after legal system refused to acknowledge frame-up despite clear evidence of fabrication, helped me understand that accountability failures aren't just historical problems, but continue affecting people today when agencies prioritize organizational interests over truth, and when legal doctrines protect officials from consequences when their misconduct destroys innocent lives. Documentary's most controversial revelation came from newly discovered personnel files showing that at least 6 of 17 agents Red Rube had killed had privately expressed concerns about evidence fabrication practices to supervisors who dismissed complaints and had warned that continued objections would result in negative performance evaluations affecting career advancement. Files proved that some victims had been reluctant participants in corruption rather than enthusiastic fabricators, and that Red Rube's systematic campaign hadn't discriminated between primary organizers and coerced followers whose participation had been motivated by fear of professional retaliation rather than by personal commitment to fraudulent enforcement. Discovery of personnel files documenting agents' private objections to fabrication generated debates among Red Rube supporters about whether systematic elimination of all 17 had been justified when some victims had borne limited personal responsibility for corruption that organizational leadership and that primary conspirators like Webb had organized, whether distinguishing between willing participants and coerced followers should have affected targeting decisions, whether killing people whose culpability varied significantly represented excessive response even when acknowledging that ATF corruption had been systematic and that conviction had been completely false. Justice Department conducted review in 2018 examining whether posthumous exoneration of Red Rube was warranted given documentary evidence proving that conviction had been based on planted evidence. Review concluded that, while evidence of ATF fabrication is substantial and clearly demonstrates that defendant was innocent of charges, federal exoneration statutes don't provide mechanisms for posthumous relief, and defendant's subsequent systematic murder of 17 agents creates complications preventing Justice Department from acknowledging innocence without appearing to condone violence that killed federal officers. Review's conclusion frustrated advocacy organizations that had hoped definitive acknowledgement of frame-up would provide vindication and would establish precedent for examining other cases where ATF evidence fabrication might have resulted in false convictions. Tennessee established Memorial and Educational Center in 2019 at former Hancock County Courthouse Museum, documenting Red Rube case through multiple perspectives, including 1,969 raid and planted evidence, 5 years false imprisonment, systematic elimination campaign, trial featuring Morrison's testimony about fabrication patterns, newly discovered documents proving organizational corruption, personnel files showing some agents had objected to practices, debates about appropriate memorialization when protagonist violence killed people whose degrees of culpability varied. Museum presented balanced historical account, refusing to characterize Red Rube as unambiguous hero or as terrorist whose violence exceeded justification. Acknowledged both federal corruption, destroying innocent life, and 17 deaths affecting families regardless of deceased agents' individual responsibility for organizational misconduct. Central exhibit featured side-by-side displays contrasting Red Rube's documented innocence with ATF's systematic fabrication practices. Visitors could read newly discovered 1,968 memo encouraging creative probable cause development, could view Morrison's testimony about participating in fabricated raids, could examine personnel files showing agents' objections to practices that supervisors had dismissed, then could view competing interpretations from historians and ethicists about whether systematic violence was justified response to institutional corruption, or whether alternative approaches should have been pursued despite legal systems' refusal to acknowledge frame-up through appeals process. Memorial Room honored 17 agents killed during campaign, listed names, and provided brief biographical information acknowledging that victims included both primary organizers of fabrication like Webb and reluctant participants who'd objected privately but had followed orders under organizational pressures. Memorial included audio recordings from agents' descendants expressing perspectives ranging from continued anger at killings to acknowledgement that deceased family members had participated in corruption deserving consequences even though systematic elimination had exceeded proportional response. Museum's final exhibit examined broader question that Red Rube's case raised about accountability when federal agencies fabricate evidence to justify operations and when legal systems refuse to provide relief for innocent defendants whose appeals are denied. Memorial Wall posed question, what should citizens do when government agencies destroy innocent lives through fabricated prosecutions and when courts defer to institutional authority rather than examining evidence suggesting frame-ups? alongside competing responses emphasizing legal channels despite their failures versus desperate measures when institutions demonstrate complete unwillingness to acknowledge corruption. By 2024, Red Rube's case remained most studied example in courses examining federal law enforcement accountability and prosecutorial misconduct, case studied in ATF training about evidence handling and about organizational pressures creating incentives for fabrication. Discussed in qualified immunity debates as illustration of how legal doctrines preventing accountability can motivate private violence when official channels systematically refuse justice. Modern libertarian and Appalachian cultural movements invoke Red Rube as symbol of resistance to federal overreach and as example of how government corruption can provoke desperate responses that society condemns, but that institutional failures make understandable when legal remedies are unavailable. Congressional hearings in 2020 examining ATF practices cited Red Rube case when questioning whether agency had implemented adequate reforms preventing evidence fabrication motivated by quota pressures. Testimony from current and former agents suggested that organizational culture still prioritized raid numbers and seizure statistics over accuracy of operations, that budget justification still depended on demonstrating enforcement success through metrics, creating incentives for exaggerating cases, or for targeting easy operations rather than focusing on significant violators. Hearings resulted in recommendations for independent oversight and for eliminating quota-based performance evaluation, reforms that Red Rube's advocates characterized as vindication of his claims about systematic corruption, even though changes came 50 years too late to prevent his false imprisonment and subsequent violence. Federal legislation passed in 2021 established process for reviewing historical ATF cases where evidence fabrication might have occurred, creating pathway for posthumous exoneration that Justice Department review had concluded didn't exist under previous statutes. Legislation was named Red Rube Caldwell Federal Conviction Integrity Act, recognition that his case had exposed corruption requiring systematic reforms even though his violent response couldn't be condoned. Under new statute, Justice Department began reviewing approximately 80 cases from 1,965 to 1,975, period where defendants had claimed frame-ups and where newly available documents suggested possible fabrication. Reviews resulted in posthumous exonerations for 14 defendants, including Red Rube, whose conviction was officially vacated in 2022 with formal acknowledgement that he'd been innocent and that ATF agents had deliberately planted evidence. Exoneration ceremony held in September 2022 at Hancock County was attended by approximately 3,000 people, including Jennifer Caldwell, who received formal apology from ATF director explaining that agency acknowledges that evidence was fabricated during 1969 raid, resulting in false conviction and 5 years imprisonment of innocent man. That organizational culture during 1,960 seconds. 1,970 seconds created pressures, motivating agents to manufacture operations, meeting quota requirements. That Reuben Caldwell's systematic elimination of 17 agents was tragic consequence of corruption that proper oversight would have prevented. That reforms implemented following his case have established accountability mechanisms designed to prevent similar fabrications. Director's apology was unprecedented. Acknowledgement of institutional responsibility for deaths resulting from corruption represented significant departure from historical pattern where federal agencies had resisted admitting misconduct even when evidence was overwhelming. But apology generated controversy from families of 17 killed agents. Some welcomed acknowledgement that deceased relatives had been participants in corruption deserving consequences, while others maintained that posthumous exoneration dishonored victims by suggesting their deaths had been justified when actually they'd been murdered regardless of organizational failures that had motivated Red Rube's campaign. Controversy demonstrated that 50 years hadn't resolved fundamental disagreements about whether systematic violence could ever be justified when responding to government corruption, and about whether acknowledging institutional failures meant condoning private vengeance that killed people whose individual culpability might have been limited even when organizational misconduct was systematic. Historical marker installed at Red Rube's grave in 2022 reflected balanced approach attempting to acknowledge multiple perspectives. Inscription reading: Reuben Red Rube Caldwell, 1921 to 2009, systematically killed 17 ATF agents who participated in 1969 raid that falsely convicted him based on planted evidence. Agents fabricated moonshine operation to meet quota requirements that organizational pressures had created. Caldwell served 5 years imprisonment before being released and conducting elimination campaign. Trial featured testimony from former agent describing systematic fabrication practices, posthumously exonerated in 2022 when documents proved innocence. Personnel files revealed 6 of 17 victims had privately objected to fabrication but participated following supervisory orders. Case prompted federal reforms including Red Rube Caldwell Conviction Integrity Act establishing review process for historical cases. This grave reminds us that government corruption, destroying innocent lives, creates desperate responses, that organizational pressures can motivate officials to fabricate evidence, meeting institutional expectations, that accountability failures affect everyone when legal systems protect agencies from consequences while innocent people suffer imprisonment, and when desperate violence becomes response that might have been prevented through proper oversight. Comparative analysis examining Red Rube's 17 victims revealed complex picture where 3 agents, including Webb, had been primary organizers of fabrication and enthusiastic participants in corruption. 8 had been followers who'd participated because organizational culture required compliance with practices that supervisors encouraged. 6 had been documented objectors who'd privately expressed concerns but had followed orders when supervisors had threatened career retaliation for continued complaints. This distribution raised questions about whether Red Rube's systematic elimination should have distinguished among degrees of culpability rather than treating all participants as equally responsible, whether killing 6 who'd objected represented excessive response, even when acknowledging that their participation had enabled corruption regardless of private misgivings. Red Rube's written confession hadn't addressed these distinctions, had characterized all 17 as participants in conspiracy, without differentiating between enthusiastic fabricators and reluctant followers or documented objectors, suggested that he'd viewed anyone who'd contributed to frame up as equally guilty regardless of their private positions or their degrees of agency in organizing fabrication that had destroyed 5 years of his life. Modern analysts examining confession debate whether distinction would have been practically possible during planning phase when identifying which agents had objected privately would have required access to personnel files that weren't available until decades later, whether expecting such discrimination was reasonable when desperate man-planning campaign of vengeance would have focused on participation rather than on motivations that internal documents later revealed. Descendants of Red Rube, including Jennifer Caldwell, who'd become prominent criminal justice reform advocate, expressed divided perspectives about great-uncle's systematic violence. Jennifer acknowledged that campaign had exposed corruption requiring reforms, but emphasized that killing 17 people, including 6 who'd objected, created victims whose families deserved recognition, that simplified narratives celebrating resistance often failed to provide. Jennifer's nuanced position created controversy within family, where some members maintained that Red Rube's actions should be defended unconditionally as justified response to government tyranny, while others agreed with Jennifer that moral complexity required acknowledging both federal corruption and excessive violence that had killed people whose degrees of responsibility varied significantly. Federal legislation establishing review process for historical cases prompted examination of broader patterns where ATF and other agencies might have fabricated evidence during periods when organizational pressures had created incentives for manufacturing operations. Department of Justice investigation reviewed approximately 300 cases from 1,960 to 1,980 period, identifying 87 where fabrication seemed likely based on patterns similar to Red Rube's case, including sudden discovery of substantial operations involving defendants with no previous suspected activity, absence of corroborating evidence beyond agents' testimony, suspicious timing when raids occurred during periods of heightened quota pressure. Reviews resulted in 31 posthumous exonerations and 12 living defendants being released after serving partial sentences, outcomes that vindicated Red Rube's claims about systematic corruption, while also highlighting that his case had been one among many where innocent people had suffered from institutional failures prioritizing organizational interests over accuracy. Contemporary debates about appropriate memorialization of Red Rube's case reflected broader conflicts about how societies should remember complex historical figures whose legitimate grievances motivated indefensible methods, about whether acknowledging government corruption meant condoning violence that killed federal officers, about how to honor victims while recognizing institutional failures that had provoked desperate responses. Annual memorial services held at Hancock County attracted both supporters celebrating Red Rube's resistance and critics condemning systematic violence. Gatherings demonstrated persistent disagreements about limits of justified resistance when government corruption destroys innocent lives, and about whether desperate measures become morally permissible when legal systems demonstrate complete unwillingness to acknowledge frame-ups despite evidence proving innocence. Modern libertarian movements and Appalachian cultural organizations invoke Red Rube as symbol of resistance to federal overreach, argue that his case demonstrates why citizens must maintain capabilities for defending themselves against government tyranny when legal remedies are unavailable, and when institutional corruption makes official channels unreliable for protecting rights. Critics counter that celebrating systematic killer of federal officers encourages anti-government extremism and undermines legitimate law enforcement, even when acknowledging that specific cases involved corruption deserving consequences through proper accountability rather than through private vengeance. By 2024, Red Rube Caldwell's systematic elimination campaign remained most studied example in courses examining government corruption and desperate responses. Case studied in federal law enforcement training about organizational pressures, creating incentives for misconduct, and about importance of accountability mechanisms, preventing fabrication, discussed in criminal justice reform movements as illustration of how institutional failures can destroy innocent lives and can motivate violence that legal systems condemn, but that moral complexity makes difficult to characterize simply as terrorism, when government corruption had created circumstances provoking desperate response. The enduring legacy of Red Rube's 1974 campaign continues shaping debates about appropriate responses to government corruption, about limits of legal resistance when institutional channels fail, about whether systematic violence can ever be justified when responding to false imprisonment based on fabricated evidence. about how society should memorialize complex events where legitimate grievances motivated indefensible methods and where victims included both corrupt agents organizing frame-ups and reluctant participants who'd objected privately but had followed organizational orders. These questions remain unresolved 50 years after Red Rube's release from false imprisonment and systematic response. Persist wherever government agencies prioritize institutional interests over truth, wherever organizational pressures create incentives for officials to fabricate evidence, wherever legal systems defer to institutional authority rather than examining claims suggesting frame-ups, wherever innocent people must decide between accepting imprisonment for crimes they didn't commit and employing desperate measures that society condemns, but that corruption sometimes provokes when alternatives are systematically denied. Until next time, remember that Red Rube Caldwell killed 17 ATF agents who'd participated in framing him with planted evidence during 1969 raid fabricated to meet quota requirements, that he served 5 years false imprisonment before systematic elimination campaign. That trial featured former agents' testimony about widespread fabrication practices throughout ATF. That newly discovered documents proved organizational leadership had encouraged creative probable cause development as policy. That personnel files revealed 6 of 17 victims had privately objected but participated following supervisory orders. That posthumous exoneration in 2022 acknowledged innocence in institutional corruption. That case prompted federal reforms establishing review process for historical fabrication cases, resulting in 31 additional exonerations, and that ultimately government corruption fabricating evidence to justify budgets creates tragedies affecting multiple generations when accountability mechanisms fail and when desperate responses become necessary for exposing institutional failures that legal systems refuse to acknowledge, despite evidence proving innocence and despite organizational patterns suggesting systematic misconduct rather than isolated errors, by individual agents acting independently without supervisory knowledge or encouragement. If this complete expanded story made you grapple with irreducible complexity of government corruption and desperate justice across 50 years, the discovery that ATF agents deliberately planted moonshine equipment to meet raid quotas that organizational pressures required, the 5 years false imprisonment that destroyed innocent mountain man's life based on fabrication that appeals courts refused to acknowledge, the systematic elimination of 17 federal agents, including 6 who'd privately objected to practices but had participated following orders, the former agent's testimony exposing widespread fabrication patterns throughout ATF during quota-driven enforcement era, the newly discovered 1,968 memo from supervisors explicitly encouraging creative probable cause development as acceptable practice, the impossible questions about whether killing 17 people could ever be justified when responding to false conviction, and whether victims whose degrees of culpability varied significantly should have been distinguished rather than being targeted equally. Leave your like and share. Subscribe for stories examining how government agency corruption and organizational pressures to meet quotas create desperate responses, how fabricated evidence destroys innocent lives while protecting officials through qualified immunity and deference doctrines, how systematic violence affects everyone when legal systems refuse to acknowledge frame-ups despite clear evidence. Comment about whether Red Rube's systematic campaign was proportional response to 5 years false imprisonment or whether alternatives existed he should have pursued. Whether 50 years and posthumous exoneration provide adequate resolution when violence killed 17 people, including reluctant participants, whether memorials should emphasize federal corruption or focus on victims' deaths and families' losses. Because these questions persist wherever government agencies prioritize organizational interests over truth, wherever quota pressures create incentives for fabricating operations, wherever legal systems defer to institutional authority rather than examining evidence suggesting frame-ups, wherever innocent people must decide between accepting imprisonment for crimes they didn't commit and employing private violence that society condemns, but that corruption sometimes provokes, when official channels demonstrate complete unwillingness to provide justice despite overwhelming evidence proving innocence and demonstrating systematic patterns of misconduct affecting dozens or hundreds of defendants, whose lives were destroyed by fabricated prosecutions serving bureaucratic interests rather than public safety or legitimate law enforcement objectives. The broader implications of Red Rube Caldwell's case extended far beyond individual tragedy when congressional investigations following posthumous exoneration examined whether systematic fabrication patterns existed throughout federal law enforcement agencies beyond ATF. Investigators discovered that quota pressures and budget justifications based on enforcement statistics had created similar incentives for manufacturing operations across DEA, FBI, and other agencies, whose funding depended on demonstrating success through metrics measuring arrests, seizures, and convictions rather than through assessing whether operations targeted significant threats or whether enforcement improved public safety. Federal review of approximately 5,000 cases from 1,960 to 1,985 period identified patterns suggesting possible fabrication in approximately 400 where evidence exhibited characteristics similar to Red Rube's case, including sudden discoveries of substantial operations, absence of corroborating evidence beyond agents' testimony, suspicious timing correlating with quota deadlines or budget review periods. Most disturbing finding was discovery that organizational cultures throughout federal law enforcement had normalized practices where fabricating evidence or exaggerating cases was acceptable when necessary for maintaining statistical performance that supervisors evaluated and that headquarters used for justifying appropriations. Internal documents revealed that explicit encouragement of creative enforcement was common throughout agencies, where leadership understood that literal accuracy was less important than demonstrating activity levels, justifying budgets and staffing. This culture had persisted despite periodic scandals exposing individual cases because systemic reforms addressing organizational incentives hadn't been implemented. Accountability for fabrication remained minimal when qualified immunity protected agents and when prosecutorial discretion meant that officials who fabricated evidence rarely faced criminal charges, even when misconduct was proven. Contemporary criminal justice reform movements emphasize Red Rube's case as example, demonstrating need for eliminating quota-based performance evaluation throughout law enforcement, argue that measuring success through arrest numbers or seizure statistics creates perverse incentives where officials prioritize quantity over quality and where fabricating easy cases becomes rational strategy for meeting expectations that organizational culture establishes. Reformers propose alternative metrics focusing on community safety outcomes, on accuracy of operations measured through conviction rates and through independent audits, examining evidence quality, on procedural justice indicators, assessing whether enforcement respects rights and maintains legitimacy rather than simply maximizing statistics that budget justifications emphasize. Red Rube's descendants, including Jennifer Caldwell, who became prominent advocate following great-uncle's posthumous exoneration, work with Innocence Project and similar organizations supporting defendants claiming fabrication, provide testimony during congressional hearings, examining law enforcement accountability, organize memorial events honoring Red Rube while acknowledging complexity, including 17 deaths that campaign caused. Jennifer's advocacy emphasizes that honoring resistance to corruption requires acknowledging all victims, including federal agents whose families suffered regardless of deceased officials' degrees of culpability, that simplified narratives celebrating violence without recognizing moral complexity do disservice to everyone affected by tragedies that institutional failures create. Modern Appalachian cultural organizations invoke Red Rube as symbol of mountain independence and resistance to federal overreach. Annual gatherings in Hancock County attract thousands celebrating his defiance while debating appropriate lessons about when violence becomes justified response to government corruption. These gatherings reflect broader tensions throughout rural America, where populations increasingly distrust federal authority and where Red Rube's systematic elimination of agents who'd framed him resonates with contemporary concerns about government overreach and about institutional corruption that legal systems seem unable or unwilling to address through official accountability mechanisms. By 2024, legacy of Red Rube Caldwell's 1974 campaign continues influencing debates about government accountability, about appropriate responses to institutional corruption, about whether systematic violence can ever be justified when legal remedies fail, about how society should memorialize complex figures whose legitimate grievances motivated indefensible methods. Annual memorial services, museum exhibits presenting multiple perspectives, ongoing advocacy by descendants attempting to honor both resistance and victims, congressional hearings citing case when examining law enforcement reform proposals all demonstrate that 50 years haven't resolved fundamental questions about limits of justified resistance to government corruption and about whether desperate measures become morally permissible when institutions demonstrate complete unwillingness to acknowledge frame-ups that destroy innocent lives while protecting officials whose misconduct serves organizational interests rather than justice or public safety.